involved in the backyard photos by closely studying Oswald's mouth in the two original pictures. By looking closely at an overlay of the two pictures, it was noted that in one photo Oswald is slightly smiling, and in the other he is slightly frowning. Two expressions, two separate photos. They also discovered minute differences in measurements of details in the background of these two photos. The roof line in one did not quite match in the other. The fence posts did not match precisely. Again, such differences, no matter how slight, supported the idea that these were separate photographs, and this seemed to invalidate the idea that they were composite fakes.
Well, it seems like we're right back where we started. Government-hired photography experts maintain that the incriminating backyard photos are exactly what they appear to be. Separate pictures of Lee Harvey Oswald with a rifle, which at least appears similar to the one said to have killed President Kennedy. Dan, just how did Jack White respond to the findings of the House committee?
Craig, things aren't always as simple as the experts make them seem. Mr. White offered us a strong rebuttal to the conclusions of the government experts. In reporting the results of the Penrose measurements of Oswald's facial characteristics, it seems the House committee was less than honest. Note in this comparison chart of Oswald photos published in an appendix to the committee's report, 3 measurements have been left out. These 3 just happen to include the same areas of suspicion raised by Jack White, namely Oswald's nose length, earlobes, and most significantly his chin. White said if these 3 missing measurements have been added to the Penrose study, it most likely would have revised the numbers to the extent that a conclusion that all of the Oswald photos were identical in facial features would not have been possible, especially considering the controversy over the shape of Oswald's chin. So the committee chose to simply delete the troublesome figures. The conclusion that the one backyard photo negative could be traced to the Imperial reflex camera is even easier to explain, according to White. He said the ballistics-type evidence of markings on the negative which matched markings made by the Imperial reflex camera can be explained 2 ways. One method would simply be to acquire the Imperial reflex camera. Keep in mind it was not found until some time after the assassination. White said an exposure could have been made through the camera which would show nothing but the markings on the edge of the negative. This fabricated negative edge, when combined with a faked backyard photo, would have resulted in a negative of the faked picture with the negative markings traceable to the Imperial reflex camera. However, Mr. White said another way to achieve the same effect would be simply to build a composite picture using one backyard background, add a figure with a rifle, then Oswald's face, and photocopy the whole thing with the Imperial reflex camera. Mr. White also pointed out to us that this backyard photograph, discovered by the Des Moines Shields years after the assassination, has a black border, indicating it was produced from the entire original negative. Yet the negative reportedly was never found and has never been made public. Mr. White said this is evidence that this photo was somehow produced without the Imperial reflex camera negative. This photo was produced with a high-quality camera with high resolution power for fine detail, indicating that the backyard photos could have been made prior to being photographed by the inferior Imperial reflex camera. That explanation was understandable enough. I then asked Mr. White to explain how Oswald could have 2 different expressions if the photos were faked, and there was actually only one face. He demonstrated that the only difference between the 2 original photos was in the area of Oswald's mouth. He explained that a clever retouch artist could have turned Oswald's mouth down with the stroke of a brush. Jack, what makes you think this was done?
Well, I've done similar things with retouching over the years. I've worked in advertising, so I know how simple it is to accomplish this. Also, after studying this matter for some time, I realized that it's physically impossible to change one's expression from a smile to a frown without moving the muscles throughout the entire face. Try it yourself sometime in the bathroom mirror. Just see if you can change from a smile to a frown without moving any part of your face but your mouth. It's impossible.
But even Mr. White was puzzled for a time by some of the apparent differences in the background of the photos.
Frankly, I was confounded at these small differences. I had long ago come to the conclusion, based on years of study, that the backyard photographs were composites and that only one true picture of the Neely Street backyard had been used. But I could not explain what seemed to be slight differences in measurements and perspective between the two photos. Then I discovered that photograph 133A seemed to have a slight downward perspective, as if the camera had been pointing down, while 133B seems to have an upward perspective, although the parallel lines of the stairway posts and the garage indicate no vertical perspective. You have to understand perspective. Artists and photographers are familiar with terms such as horizon lines and vanishing points. Notice how, from this perspective, my thumb covers a photo on the wall behind me. Notice what happens when the camera moves just slightly. You get a totally different perspective. You can demonstrate this for yourself by holding out one thumb and closing one eye. When you open the closed eye, you get a different perspective. It all has to do with the perspective of the viewer, in this case, the camera. I found that 133B did seem to have a stretch in perspective, but only in one direction. So I began to experiment in the darkroom with the 133A print in the easel stand and the 133 negative in my enlarger. I was familiar with the process known as keystoning, which is a darkroom technique to introduce a false perspective to a one-dimensional photograph. By simply tilting the easel under the enlarger, it makes the resulting photograph appear to have a slightly different perspective. This was the single most thrilling moment of my investigation, because when I tilted the easel, the backgrounds came into perfect alignment, proving that the two backgrounds of the backyard photographs were identical. I had reversed the process of whoever made the composite photographs. I had proved to myself that they were nothing more than clever fakes concocted in some darkroom somewhere using sophisticated graphic and photographic techniques. In my investigation of the backyard photographs, I had hoped to answer some questions about their origin and authenticity. Now there are more questions than ever. If they are fakes, as I feel I have demonstrated, then who produced them? Why they were produced is obvious enough: to incriminate Oswald as a presidential assassin. But who had the ability to produce such forgeries? It seems to me they must have been made prior to the assassination, and this means someone other than Oswald had prior knowledge of what was about to happen. It also seems reasonable to conclude that these fakes were produced in a sophisticated facility with all of the equipment necessary for the techniques used. Therefore, I conclude that these backyard photographs, important evidence, are fakes.
We must remember that Mr. White's conclusions of fakery have been echoed by foreign photographic experts in Canada and England. Now let's return to Jim Mars and hear his thoughts on this issue.
I think I speak for many people who have studied the assassination when I thank Jack White and the many others who have made such a painstaking study of the backyard photographs. It appears obvious to most researchers that serious questions remain regarding the authenticity of these photographs, despite the pronouncements of government experts. I need not remind the audience of the many instances that the government pronouncements have proven false. And in this case, I'm afraid that in recent years, certain people within the federal government have become suspect in Kennedy's unsolved murder. In the coming years, it'll be up to the citizens of the United States to look beyond the official pronouncements regarding Kennedy's assassination and view the available evidence for themselves.